This is Senior Algebra Section 9.2. Today we're solving quadratic equations by completing the square here. Today we're doing it only with the leading coefficient of 1 here. So when we talk about completing the square, it's a process of solving a quadratic. We've looked at solving quadratics with factoring, and we've looked at it with extracting square roots. So if I'm looking here, when I have that squared here, how can I get rid of that squared? I can take the square root, and I get plus or minus 16 here. So I have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 4, and then it's negative x minus 3 equals 4, x minus 3 equals negative 4. So I get my two answers, x equals 7 and x equals negative 1. The thing I want to focus on is this. When I get something that is squared on one side, so right there I have the squared part on one side. In order to solve it, to get rid of that squared, I can take the square root. So that's what we're going to look to do. We're going to look to get something that is squared, a perfect square. So typically when we do this, we'd probably move the 8 over, get it equal to 0. Well, in this one, we're going to factor that trinomial on the left. So I have x squared minus 6x plus 9. That factors into x minus 3 times x minus 3. Now that's nice because I can write that as x minus 3 quantity squared equals 8. And now it's just like the problem we just looked at. If I have something squared, I can take the square root. So I get x minus 3 is plus or minus 8. I'm going to move the 3 over. So my final answer is going to be 3 plus or minus the square root of 8. Now we could simplify the square root of 8 into 2 root 2. We will later. But for right now, that's okay. But the key is, again, get it into something that is squared, a perfect square. So in example 2, all we're doing is trying to make it a perfect square. So we have x squared plus 8x plus something. And I want to make it a perfect square, which means when I think about this, we know it's going to be x, and I want that last number there to be the same thing. So I look at the 8. Well, what two numbers which are the same will add to 8? Well, okay, so what two numbers add to 8? They're the same, 4 and 4 here. So if I know that it's going to be 4x and 4x, I know that I'm going to have 4 and 4, which is 16. So I get x plus 4 equals 16. If I look at b now, I have 4x. Well, if I know that's going to be the same, that's going to be 2x and 2x. So that's going to be x plus 2 quantity squared equals that. In c, so I have x squared minus 6x. Again, I look at the middle term. My middle term is negative 6, so I know it's going to be half of that. But it's going to be half of that and then squared here, so it's plus 9. Negative 3 times negative 3. So it's going to be x minus 3. And then the last one, d, my middle term is a negative 10. Again, what adds to negative 10 that's the same? Well, 5 and 5 here. So that means my last term has to be 25. It's going to be x minus 5 and x minus 5. So taking a look, how did I get that? Again, it's always going to be half of my middle term, the single term, the x term, and then squared. So if I look at like C here, well, half of 6 is 3. Negative 6 over 2 is 3. And it's negative 3 squared here. Notice the number inside, negative 3, that's what it factors into. And what did I add? I added negative 3 squared. So here in D, that's negative 5 squared, which is 25. And negative 5 is what it factors into. So the general steps for completing the square here. Number 1, has to have a coefficient of 1, meaning the a, the number in front of x squared, has to be 1 here. For the ones we're doing right now, they are going to be 1. If it wasn't, you'd divide through by a. After that, now we have to write it in the correct form, which means this. We want to make sure the variables are on one side of the equation and the constants are on the other side. So if I'm looking here, the ax squared and the bx is on one side, and the c, my constant, my number, is on the other side. So I get the squared term, the single term on one side, the c, my constant, just the number, on the other side. At this point, now I have to complete the square, meaning this. I'm going to add something to both sides that will make the left side a perfect square. Now, what do I add? I'm always going to add half of b squared. So it's always b divided by 2, or b times 1/2, or half of b, whatever you want to think of it as, squared. And that's going to make it a perfect square. And again, if I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other. And then I just solve it by using the square root. So let's take a look at example 3 here. We have a 1 there in front of the x squared. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get the x squared and the x on one side, the 1 on the other. So I'm going to move the 1 to the other side. I subtract 1 from each side, I get this. So then I have to figure out, what am I going to add to both sides here? Now again, I want to make the left side a perfect square. So I'm always going to add something here. And what do I add? I always add b over 2 squared. So what's my b? My b is the number in front of x. In this case, 6. So I take on the side 6 over 2 squared. So that's 3 squared. Or I'm going to add 9 to both sides. At this point, now I factor the left-hand side. And it factors into x plus 3, or x plus 3 quantity squared. And that equals 8. At this point, now it's just like example 1, just like 9.1 that we were doing before. How do I get rid of the squared? I take the square root. Whenever I introduce a square root into the problem, I have to include the plus or minus. So I have x plus 3 equals plus or minus 8. I subtract 3 and I get negative 3 plus or minus square root of 8. So x is negative 3 plus or minus. Now I'm going to simplify square root of 8 into 4 and 2, so 2 root 2. All right, last one here. So first thing, take the 12, move it over to the other side. So I get x squared minus 10x. And now I have to figure out what to add to both sides. What do? Half of b, or b divided by 2, and then square it. So if I look at my middle term is a negative 10. Negative 10 over 2 squared. Well, that's what? Negative 5 squared. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. The left side factors just like I expected it to. It's going to factor into a perfect square. Now in this one you have to be a little bit careful because the middle term is a negative. So it's going to be x minus 5, x minus 5. And now at this point, right, how do I get rid of something that is squared? I take the square root. Plus or minus, whenever I introduce a squared into the problem. And now I have x minus 5 equals plus or minus square root of 13. Move the 5 over, and I get x equals 5 plus or minus square root of 13. The bell means we're done.